You've spoken about the othering of Latin jazz. You brought up the cartoon as well, and I want to dive into the roots of it. Why was Latin jazz othered? Why was the perception of Latin jazz the way it was?
Yeah. Well, if we look at jazz prior to the 1940s, you'll see iterations of Caribbean and jazz intermixed constantly on every single bandstand. And that was when jazz was at its most popular, where jazz was synonymous with popular music of the day, like during the swing era in the 1930s. Okay. Those bands were playing congas and rumbas because they were the popular dances of the day, along with the Lindy Hop, right? So there was this fluidity of moving between styles because the music was so attached to what was ever popular in the dance world. It was dance music. In the 1940s, there was a shift. There was a shift in this country. First of all, it was the beginning in post-World War II years, it was the beginning of the civil rights movement, the very early iterations of that. So the Congress for Racial Equality started in, I think, 43 or mid-40s. It was where the discourse started to come about where jazz is revolution. Jazz is a black music expression as a way of pushing back against the racism that so many of the folks that were drafted in World War II and fought for this country then came back and had to face. So we were really in a kind of a cultural crisis at that moment. And that was precisely at the moment where we start to see writers and thinkers referring to this music as black expression, as recognizing, prior to this, there was like very few overt statements that jazz is an African-American art form or jazz is a black art form, or at that time it would be a Negro art form is how they would refer to it at that point. And we start to see people like Amiri Baraka starting to write things like that. Albert Murray was another really important figure that was talking about it. You'd see iterations about this music referenced like in Ralph Ellison's works as well. So some of the top writers coming from African-American culture start talking about this music in a different way in the 1940s, where they start taking ideas that Ellison had and then pushing them forward. And a younger generation of musicians, especially beboppers, started to recognize that. Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, that realm where they were starting to play music that was not necessarily solely attached to dance. And the roots of this are earlier. Duke Ellington had repertoire of dance music, but he also had like more art music. He was writing things called symphonies and things like that, trying to align himself with classical music and high art. And he really pushed that idea, but it kind of came to fruition in the 1940s. So we start to see a split with popular music and jazz. There were still jazz musicians who were playing very popular iterations of the music, but then there was a whole other group that were talking about modernism in music. They were talking about intellectualism, black intellectualism, that jazz asserted that. The tempo started speeding up. Like, if you listen to Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie and folks like that play, the speeds are so much faster than was happening in the swing era. The chords were more complicated. The speed of thought that is necessary to play that way is superhuman. And so we start to see that we get this cultural shift, and we start to get this discourse around jazz as a black music expression. There's an ownership that's taken, because at this point, jazz is like global. And it's almost as though black culture now, to assert its pride, says, wait a minute, we need to take back ownership of this music. This is our music. Yes, it's popular around the world and it resonates around the world, and people of all creeds and ethnicities are playing it, but fundamentally it's our music. And that discourse just gets more and more militant as we move from the 1940s into the 1960s with the civil rights movement, and for good reason, right? Because you don't want to erase African-American culture by talking about this as a global music. No, African-American culture is centered of this. This music wouldn't exist without that culture. But what's the definition of African-American culture? what's the definition of Black culture in the United States? It's really globalized. There's a huge West Indian context in that. There's a huge West African and Black diasporic element of that. There's an indigenous element as part of that. It's a very rich tapestry in and of itself. So, but that was not necessarily politically the most important message that needed to happen in the time of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. It needed to be Black. It needed to be African American, and so that's where that accentuates the othering of when musicians like Dizzy starts to improvise with Cuban musicians to try to come up with something novel.